Eric, you're in Arizona. What's your lockdown status there?
Um, it's we have a stay-at-home order, but it's very lenient, not very strict at all. So I haven't. I mean, I'm staying home completely, as is my wife. But a lot of other places, other than the restaurants being closed, feels pretty business as normal. Yeah, the
Right.
restaurants are closed and grocery stores are busy, but that's about it.
What about so restaurants, schools,
Schools,
and I guess
yeah,
all social places? What about churches, that type of stuff?
yeah. Most churches are not meeting
Right.
in person. Yeah, but it's still like as far as people like there's I expected to be a lot less traffic if I ever had to, but the few times we have to drive somewhere, you'll still hit rush hour, and that's surprising to me.
Yeah, we're pretty shut down here, and there's not much traffic. It's kind of like Christmas everywhere. You know, Christmas morning when you're driving
Right.
along and everything's dead.
My normal office is right by is that shares a parking lot with a movie theater, and so if I go in on Saturdays, and it's very strange to see that parking lot empty on a Saturday because it's never empty ever, but because the theater shut down.
Hmm. How about yourself, Paul? I don't know if you got a mic or not, so don't feel obligated if you're not connected.
Oh, it's pretty locked down here.
You pretty locked down. Paul's in the UK.
Yeah. Well, we've actually been in household isolation for 2 weeks because my wife and I are pretty confident we've actually had the virus.
Huh.
So we come out this weekend from complete isolation, which will be
Right.
interesting. But there's not a lot of difference, is there, really, between isolation and social distancing now? So everyone's staying at home apart from urgent shopping and medicines and the occasional exercise. So I'm not sure it's going to make a huge difference.
Hmm. I had a really great link, and I'm looking for it. Just it was a link to. There's a lot of visualizations, and everybody's jumping on the COVID stat visualizations, but this one was decent because it didn't put the x-axis as time, which is what almost all of them do. But really, it's kind of a poor indicator because it doesn't really matter if it takes a week or a month to spread through the population. You're more concerned about is the rate of growth and things like that changing. So the time axis can kind of tell that, but doesn't really tell the change. And I'm just seeing I went and deleted it, but I should have it somewhere.
I must admit, it made me smile when I saw the exponential graph, which was measuring how much time we're spending looking at exponential graphs.
That's funny. That's funny. Well, I think my biggest beef, I guess, is most people don't understand logs. So, like,
Yeah,
most non-technical people, that's a pretty advanced math concept. And
indeed.
they're looking at it as if it's a linear chart, not realizing that it's just dropping things down by a derivative. So,
Yes, it makes it look less bad than it is, doesn't it?
yeah, well, you like because it's the second derivative is the rate of change of your actions on a log chart. So, in other words, if we do something that's going to make a change in the future, we still may be accelerating, but the rate of acceleration may be slowing down, and you can't see that on a log graph,
No,
especially when you once you get into the vertical parts where the chart is going very exponential. A tenth of a degree could be an order of magnitude, and you can't see that.
absolutely. Yeah.
It's only on the very, very the bottom, the flatter parts. And of course, when you blow everything up, the flatter parts are exponential too. So I was watching a press conference, and they were saying, "Oh, this is the flat part. This is the flat part," but it's not the flat part. It's just because the scale's compressed, and they don't really understand that. So, unfortunately,
And also the graphs comparing one country to another, you know, they don't take into account the massively different testing regimes and how many people are in the country at all in the first place and how densely populated a country is.
Yeah, well, just a per capita. So you're looking at absolute numbers, and it means nothing. If I have an island of 10, or say 100 for easy numbers, right? So per capita is more useful than an absolute number.
Yeah.
So you always have to figure these things out. And I mean, that's can be quite misleading with the whole press.
And also the only measurement that is consistent across all countries in absolute terms is deaths.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Really?
Yeah. Those ones are pretty much always reported, and everything else above that,
everything else
not so much.
Is not necessarily consistently counted.
Yeah.
Is it? So.
Yeah. The further you get out to, I think the loosest statistic or the poorest statistic will be the number of people who currently have or had actually would even be less than have for accuracy. Yeah.
Yeah. Because there seems to be such a lot of talk of asymptomatic cases that are not even on the graph at all, are they? So.
No.
I read something today that said they thought there might be at least 4 times as many asymptomatic cases as the ones that they're recording.
I would think so.
Sorry?
I said I would think so.
Yeah, at least I would have thought more, perhaps. But again, it's all numbers that we're not used to dealing with, isn't it? And concepts.
Here it is. Here, I'm going to share my screen. This is off topic, but we'll get started. Just waiting for people to roll in. Actually, we've got pretty much almost here. So this is a really interesting chart here. Can you see that? Okay.
Not yet.
Pause, share. I want to stop my share and restart my share again.
Aha.
All right.
Here it comes. Yep.
So I'm just going to reload this. This is animating over time.
Okay.
So what's unique about this chart is it's log X and log Y. Usually you just have log Y.
Okay.
And the takeaways here are that of these countries that are listed, it's not every country, the rate of growth per existing case compared to new cases is nearly identical. It doesn't matter the population. Like the difference between the biggest and the worst countries here, almost identical. And it's not until the countries pop out of this line that they've got stuff under control. So you can see China does, South Korea, Switzerland here. Italy is starting to. Yeah. Spain is starting to.
Yeah.
Right. You can just start to see those types of things.
Yeah.
Right. But otherwise left to their own. And you can actually see Iran here. It looks like they started to, and then they must have, I don't know, something changed and it's starting to merge. You can see this line will eventually merge into that same streamline again. Yeah. If you put all the countries on here. So I'll paste this link in the, because I think it's a pretty neat chart to play with, and you can change the axis and things like that.
Cool.
Chat. If you're a numbers junkie.
We'll
should go. You can put it in the chat, presumably, can you?
Yeah, it's in the chat there. So I think everybody's more or less here, and if not, well, we're recording things anyway.
Are you implying that some of us are only partially here? Yeah.
Yeah, could be.
But you are the only one with your camera on. I feel like you and Fred maybe. So is all I saw.
Yeah, everybody's shy. Everybody's shy with their cameras. You know, I was on a meetup group. Was a Toronto JavaScript meetup group, and normally that one has like 100 people who come out to the meetings, and there was about 15 people on the online one, so not nearly as many. But they all had their cameras on, which is interesting. I noticed in our FileMaker community a little bit less, but they're on average, no disrespect to us, they're on average a younger community, and you know, they're more into selfies and doing stuff like that. So it's not a big deal.
I just don't have a camera accessible at the moment because my laptop's in a dock shut.
Yeah, and everybody has their shut. So that's a common thing. So that's fine. I don't take offense to it or anything. I don't think anybody else does anyway. But I do tend to prefer camera on because I think it's better from a rapport aspect. But nonetheless. So this is our third 4th. Well, it's actually our 8th or 9th Friday Live, but this is our 3rd for this series that we're doing. And we were originally going to do this and break it into, going to have 2 parts to it, API first design and HAM, our headless authorization module. But I think this is going to take a little bit longer, perhaps, and the HAM one takes a little bit more to prepare. So I'm going to pass up probably onto Eric, and he can do that. So. All right. Okay. So if you have any questions, I think by all means, just jump right in. I think we should try to treat these instead of as a presentation, treat them as a live meeting. And that way everybody can just jump right in with their comments and things. Excuse me. All right. So I figured I'd lead today and talk about what I call API first design. And it's not really my term by any means. You can Google API design, and we'll talk a little bit more about what it is and how it affects or how we can implement this design pattern into our FileMaker programming. Some of you guys are going to say, oh, I'm already doing some of that stuff now. And some people will say, holy cow, I don't do any of this right now. So we have sort of all levels of developers on our calls. So this is kind of a wide spectrum, if you will.
Do you want to launch that poll then too?
Pardon me?
You have that poll ready. Are we going to launch
Yeah,
that?
yeah. If you want to throw some polls in there and, just random questions and stuff too, that would be great.
I meant the better, or you already have one, the better forms question.
Yeah. If you could launch that. I'm just going to, just a sec here. That's pretty neat how it pops up there. Just give me a quick sec here.
We should have added a question about who's already using API first, but maybe we'll save that for the end.
Yeah, you can maybe you can add that in. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk. Just a second, I'm just going to get my stuff ready here. We're going to talk about what API first is, and to explain it better, and you excuse my Charles cat here, I didn't have time to build it to scale or to paint it, so we'll go kind of crude here. Typically, what we'll do is we'll look at a typical design flow that you normally do in FileMaker, and then can you see that okay? It's my iPad.
I can't see it at all.
Yeah, let me just stop the sharing again and reshare it. It seems like it may not be tracking my new screen. How about now?
I can see it.
Sorry, you can or cannot?
I can see something that says compose.
Yeah, okay, great. All right, yeah, that's great. All right, so typically in FileMaker, we need a button and we click on the button, that's the go button there, and we need to do something. We need to send an email. So I'm going to use an email as a workflow, and we'll talk about the way we normally do things, and then from an API first design, how we would break this up. And there's a good chance that what you're doing is somewhere in between those two extremes. So typically we would click a button, and that button would run a script, and then somehow we would probably grab the parameters for this email. We'd probably grab them from the layout. So we would sort of it would be the layout, and from there we would get the email and maybe the body. And we would compose that email and body there. And if you're really a real simple version of a script, we would actually use FileMaker send mail. And we would send we'd send a mail script. We would send it out. And then when we're done, we might do something like an alert, right? Show custom dialog, some type of an idea like that. So there's a fundamental problem with this. It's super, super easy, but we're super locked into this particular script, because later on our boss or whoever comes up to us and they say to us, hey, can you make this script send from another place? So we have another field, but maybe our table is named differently or something. So we can't actually use that existing layout because our context changed. So we duplicate the script, and then they probably want some different functionality. So we change a few things, and we have some new functionality. I'm going to call this number 2. I'm going to call this number 1. And we have some new functionality. Now we have 2 scripts that do almost the same thing. Then they say, well, you know what? These mails look really, really terrible. Can you use MailChimp? We say, okay, no problem. We can do that. So we do the same thing again. And we may or may not break this into two other parts. And we end up hacking up the script a little bit. And we say, okay, maybe I'm going to break this into 2 components, and I'll have my MailChimp interface. And we might, if we're really particular, we might call a second script that actually talks to MailChimp. Does that make sense so far?
Yep. All
right. So what API first design is to take away, and we want to separate some of these concerns. So let me just go to a fresh spot here. So if you actually look at a very original script and we were to separate things, this is part of UI here, right? This is some business logic. And this part here, the send mail part, that part is really a connector. And the alert is coming back to UI again. Right? So we're going through these different phases. And because they're all integrated in one script, and I'm just using a very, very simple script, this maybe has 15 lines of code or something like that, not even. Because they're all into one script, we're really, really locked in terms of growth. So if we were to break this out and break it into separate components, we have the button again. Okay, I'll use Go. So here's my button. And I press my button, and from here, I'm going to have to run some type of script. This first section of script is going to handle the button, right? So I'm going to call it a button handler. And what its concern is to take the context of FileMaker and to assemble the information that we need that's unique to that button. So it really only handles maybe that one button or that one bit of context. In fact, with FileMaker, we're lucky enough that in the button, we can actually pass some context along as a script parameter in there as well. So we have this button handler, and then our button handler is going to call another level of script. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller because I'm running out of space here. All right, so then our button handler is going to call another script. And this is going to actually compose our email. So maybe that puts a dear sir, dear ma'am, and the button handler is just going to pass in the first name. It might pass something like Charles. And this one is dear Charles. Okay. And then finally, if we want to go a little further, we abstract this out into our lowest level of API, which would be our part that would send the email. Right, and that may connect up to something. So right away what we've done is we've separated these concerns, just like we've taken these 3 boxes that were up at the top over here, these three separate areas, business logic, connector, UI, and we've basically broken them down into separate scripts. Right? This is the fundamental concept of API first design, is where you're designing something to separate the concerns, and then the API part. Let me just see if I can. Will my screen? Let me just see if did that go back to the slideshow, or is it still on the iPad? Slideshow. Okay, great. So API really stands for Application Program Interface. Sometimes you see Programming Interface. And a lot of times we're sort of recently in the FileMaker community, we hear API and we think external connectors. But that's only because we're just starting to be exposed to the rest of the world. The rest of the world doesn't see an API just being your external part. It's your internal stuff as well. So it's the interface that the programmer, you as a developer, see whenever you're activating it or using a script or a custom function or even a table for that matter. It's that interface. So if we go back to my drawing here, we have interfaces every time we run a script. So if you think this is an interface here, there's an interface here, there's an interface here, and then ultimately this send mail interfaces to some mail account, some mailbox. And that's an interface there, or technically on this side, it's a connector. And then on this side here, it's an interface or an API. So if we start to think about our code and we start to develop it like that, we have a lot of advantages. Later on, someone comes up to us, and this is maybe the 3 scripts we have instead of 1 script. And they say, well, can you make this button work from a different area? It's totally different context. And so what we have to do then is we'll only have to replicate. We'll only have to replicate this top level of code. And because we have a consistent interface at our compose level, this API here, because we have a really consistent interface, we don't have to replicate anything down below that. So now that code becomes more scalable. Now we're reducing our code, we're reducing our cruft. Then they come up to us and they say, well, you know what? It's sending it to the mailbox, but we really want to send this. We really want to send this to using MailChimp. So we say, okay, well, we can convert this to MailChimp if we're gonna do MailChimp for everybody. Because coming into this piece of script, this is a consistent piece of code. So we're not changing anything in these upper levels up here to suddenly support MailChimp. Then they come up to us and say, well, we really want a communication distribution system. And the communication distribution systems should be able to pick whether they want to distribute it through email, through SMS, and so on. Or you may want to second source your mail client. So when that happens, we add another layer in here. We're actually going to add, I'm just going to erase this for a second or move this down. And we add another layer in here, and we'll call it a dispatch. And what this dispatch will do is it will look at some type of information coming in, and it will dispatch either to MailChimp or say Twilio. Again, I just added a ton of functionality into my code here by only adding 2 scripts, right? When I added this extra functionality, I really only added this new script here and this one over here. I used the same interface that's over here. And I use the same interface coming in here. And I'll explain how we can use the same interface a little later on, right? But basically the API coming into these scripts and going out of these scripts hardly changed, and I added a ton of functionality. And that's the whole concept of API first, is that we're adding functionality to something, and we're allowing something to scale, to grow, without adding more and more code. So let me just jump back here for a sec. Right. So I just went through that. Right. So where do we want to use this kind of stuff? Basically, we've been talking a lot about verticals, and I have a particular interest because that's my industry. But about 25-30% of Better Forms developers, and I think probably a good percentage of just non-Better Forms but FileMaker-based apps have verticals. And at least it certainly seems that from the people I talk to, or software as a service. And why you want to add these is because you make your app, I don't want to say future-proof, but you make it much more scalable for the future. Typically, one of the things that FileMaker developers are always I'm hearing all the time is they're worried about, well, I don't know if I should continue with FileMaker or not. And my answer is to continue with FileMaker, absolutely. But start to change the way you build things. And when you build stuff with like an API first design, you're making it a lot more future-proof, because you can take these modules that we just had, for example, right here. And something like a product like Claris Connect comes along. And we say, oh, I want to use Claris Connect now because maybe my Twilio module or my send mail module was a little bit flaky. So maybe I'm not happy with that, or I just like the way something else works, or maybe there's another communication medium or substrate that we want to communicate with. So what we do is when we want to use Claris Connect or something like that, again, we're doing the same thing. We're adding, actually, let me just do this here. We're adding one more onto here, onto our dispatcher. Now we have another substrate or another method that we can transmit out of, right? This script here is adding the logic to inspect the API coming in. So it's inspecting this API coming in, and it's deciding where should I go? Should I go here, here, or send the stuff out to here? And that's all it does. A very, very simple concern. But by adding that in there, which is something we generally don't do, that type of concept, we've given our ability to now to extend our code into a much more robust system. And in fact, this is not FileMaker anymore, right? That's an external system now. And we haven't changed anything from the user's perspective, up here from when they click the go button. Is that sort of resonating? Is that making any sense at all?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So that's why your apps can grow. And it's really, really important for that, because if your app can't grow, then as a business, you become stagnant. I was in a call just yesterday, right? And the user actually had the same thing, but it was a UI problem, mostly from the sounds of it. And it was a UI problem where he's built all this cruft into his UI and had to really, really rethink the whole application. But it's the same kind of thing. I'm sure if we looked under the hood, we'd find the same problems. So as far as cost goes, this is kind of how API design or API first design works. Initially, the cost to develop this extra code, there's a little bit more code in there. So if you look at the first feature here, oops, did I jump to the wrong? Let me jump to the wrong page. There we go. Is that better? You can see that graph? Can you see that graph? Okay.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I can
All right, this one here. You can see that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. It should look pretty good. It's not exactly to scale though, and there's no logarithmic charts or graphs or axes on here. So basically, initially, you have a higher development cost because you're effectively writing 3 times the amount of scripts, 4 times maybe even the amount of scripts per what one script can do. But these scripts are smaller, so it's not just like 4 times the cost. It's more like maybe double the cost. And then eventually you start to end up with a whole bunch of APIs. You develop an API that connects to MailChimp. You have an API that fetches a certain data or generates an invoice, another one that handles some print routine, and so forth. And when you do that, you end up with a whole collection of these microservices. And then your cost to develop new features starts to drop down. So initially it starts higher, but then later on it starts to drop. And it stays relatively low. It stays linear. It doesn't get exponentially higher. Whereas when you don't design something well for the growth in the future, your cost starts to go higher and higher. And it becomes harder and harder for you to add these new features. And I see that all the time with developers that we have a really high level of support. And quite often I'm looking at people's other pieces of code not related to Better Forms or anything, just to FileMaker in general. And I see that all the time. It's like, oh, I have that script. And now we added that script in there for this one particular use case, but we're not using it anymore. And it just grows and grows. So you end up with this, I call it pasta, or you end up with a spaghetti code. And the amount of cruft goes up and up. All right. I'm just going to switch back here. So who's already doing this kind of stuff? Some of the big dev houses, like if you look at Carbon's framework, for example, it uses an API first type design, not 100% everywhere, but I would say probably about 50% of it is designed like that. And that's kind of the philosophy of that. That particular framework is really designed to scale out to big apps. And it's not about scale in terms of performance of FileMaker. It's scaling in terms of not developing cruft for the future. Right? System architects. So if you're designing a big system And what I mean by a big system is Eric last week was presenting his Submit Guru app, and there's a link in the last email for that if you haven't watched it already. That's going to become a big application down the road. And if he doesn't keep his clean, and I'm pretty sure it's pretty clean, but if he doesn't keep his code really, really clean, there's going to be a ton of cruft in there. And then when it comes time to revamp the system or pivot in some fashion, he's not going to be able to do that. So if you have these separate modules, separate chunks of code, you have that ability to change. I noticed this new version of Zoom. The old Zoom, I just upgraded my Zoom, and the old Zoom used to have a green border around the screen of which you're sharing. And it looks like my new version does not. So I have no idea which screen I'm sharing right now. It should be PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So that's why those are the people who are using this, and virtually every other company in the world who has a team of developers and a big code base. I'm not talking about like little one-off type things where somebody's got an app and they're running their app and they're maintaining it, but somewhere where there's more than maybe a handful of developers, because now those developers can work on one specific function, one piece of code. If you look at Stripe, and if anybody's used the Stripe API, has anybody actually used the Stripe's API and connected with it and logged into their backend?
No.
All right. I can't log into my Stripe right now, but when you log into Stripe, they have this user interface, and then at the bottom of a lot of the screens, it shows the API calls that it made. The user interface in Stripe is 100% separate. It's not, I mean, this is how all bigger apps are built anyway, including Better Forms apps. The user interface is really separate from the code base than the back end. So it's actually hitting the exact same API endpoints that you would hit if you were making a connector from FileMaker. And that's pretty neat. And you see that with a lot of programs now. They're actually building their APIs first, and they get their black box functionality, and then later on they wrap a user interface on top of that. And you can actually separate UI totally from FileMaker. We tried to do that years ago with the separation model, but it's not a true separation model. It's more like split model, I would call it. A true separation model will separate the front end totally from the back end. So there's not table occurrences or anything. You're passing just data in a very similar fashion to the way we pass script parameters and hooks in Better Forms. All right. So some of these advantages, there's quite a few advantages here. And then what we'll do is we'll look at some examples, and we'll walk through some suggestions and things like that as well. So you reduce a lot of the spaghetti in your code, because each separation or each block is a separation of concern. The code is usually context independent. I say usually because looking at the design that I did right here, if we look, can you see that okay? That's a drawing. Just want to make sure. Save. Eric, can you see that? Anybody?
Yep.
Crickets?
Yeah.
Right. Sorry, just let me know, because otherwise I have no idea, because it has failed a couple times so far. So this is super, super context dependent, this original script, right? We're hitting the button, we're running a script. If that script gets run from anywhere else, it just will simply not work. Right, the mail, it's bound to its concern, because the send mail script is hardwired right in there, stuck in the middle. I can never change that easily without breaking the script, and the script is not really reusable unless I have identical context in my other code. So this here, on the other hand, these scripts are not context, or these top level ones are context. I'm just going to highlight them in yellow here. These top level ones are context dependent. That's not exactly yellow. They are context dependent, or they may not be. They don't technically have to be, because with a button, you can actually pass the parameters from the layout. And that's actually a really good way if you're not doing that already. Click the button. Don't say, don't get the parameter that you need for something from the field or from the layout. Instead, pass it through a script parameter in the button, and then you've just separated your button from the script, and your script is more robust and it can be used for multiple buttons. Here I have 2 buttons, but if I actually pass the parameter in the button into the script, I can effectively get rid of this chunk of code here, because it's pretty much a repeat, and I just called it here. Oops. Right, I call it, I jack in that way. So now both buttons are using the same piece of button handler code, but they're just passing parameters into that button. Much better way of designing something. And if I ever want to add some type of security level in terms of what the person's allowed to do, I have this demarcation line right here. And anything before that, I have to judge the security and decide whether they're authorized to do something. So it's testable. And this is a really, really big one. We don't do a ton of testing. There's a little bit of, I guess, a little bit of talk in the community about testing, but generally speaking, we don't do a lot of testing. All the code that we write in our backend for Better Forms has tests for it. Right? So that means we can run a test and we can see stuff that's broken right away within the test, and stuff breaks all the time. And you normally don't realize it's broken until somebody reports that, unless you run the test prior to that. What makes these chunks of code testable is if I look at this, let's jump back to my Charles cat here. If I look at just this one section here, let me just look at this. Compose email, and it's supposed to take in a parameter and it's supposed to output something. I can test that code really, really easily because all I have to do to test it is I have to give it a parameter of name, something like this. And let's say email. Right? And I have to feed that into the script. That gets dropped into my black box of my script, and my script is supposed to produce something. So it produces some kind of output. Like that. So that's really testable. That means that in your production, which is probably a development environment, you can make those changes confidently and run something right away and know if you've broken something in here. Like if I go and change, something to something else inside here, I can test to see if it works right away, because this might come out all messed up. All right. So that's the idea of that for the testability. Versioning is really, really cool. This is another thing. This is another advantage you can do with this. I had my original code here, my original composer, let's say this compose block, and it normally puts together Dear Charles. And I want to come up with some new code that's not quite 100% compatible with it for some reason. Or maybe my button handler, that might be even a better example. My button handler, I want to create this new kind of button handler that can handle button bars and a whole bunch of other things. So I can actually
throwing in a new parameter or some other variable that's
it's not just actually that's a really good point. It's not just a new parameter, because a new parameter technically might not, and we'll talk about that in a bit, may not break your API. If your input parameters are designed right, adding functionality generally won't break an API.
That's true, yeah.
But if it works so differently that, and I'll show you an example of what we have two APIs, and we just rewrote one like this week, and or at least we used a version that we deployed earlier on, but we're just using it for everywhere else this week. And it's a totally separate version of code. So I can have this V2 code sitting here, and it can sit parallel to this one. And as long as its output is compatible with the next block that it has to connect to, I haven't repeated any other further code. So now I can have these versions, and I can, pardon me?
Are we supposed to be able to see the iPad right now?
Oh, crud, I'm sorry. Here, let me do this.
Yep.
Right, so we got to there, and now there, I'll just kind of repeat. So I can add this new V2 code here like this. And as long as it jacks into this one here, we're good to go. Right? So we maintain compatibility. Oops, sorry, by doing that. Refactoring and continuous CDCI, you'll sometimes see this in other circles, continuous deployment, continuous integration. We kind of do that in FileMaker, but in a bad way. We just kind of go and make changes to production quite often. But many people do have proper deployment mechanisms and things like that. Because your code is broken into small chunks, you can deploy that bit of code however you manage to port it over. Maybe it's just a script. Nice thing about context insensitive scripts, which is what most of your APIs should be, you can pretty much cut and paste them and they work, right? Because there's no context. They're not relying on a layout or anything like that. All right. Oops, sorry. Just a few other things. I'm just going to blast through these. Sorry, I didn't have time to shorten these down. But API first design gives you a design spec for the future. So if you ever outgrow FileMaker in any fashion, right, or FileMaker changes in some fashion, you more or less have a design spec of what to build, because you can go back to your original APIs here for the send mail routine, and I can say, this is what goes in, this is what comes out of this block. This is what goes into this next block, let's say down over here, this is what comes out. And this is what goes into this block, and this is what comes out, and this is what it should do. I can take that to any developer now in any other language, and they understand what to build. So if your whole system is built like this, as long as those blocks test, whatever they build will be compatible. And likewise, if you want to move this entire section of code out of FileMaker because you're going to send thousands or something like that, or whatever it is, you want to move that out of there, you can give the specs for those blocks to another developer. They can go and build it up, and then you just have to call. So you have this consistent interface again, right? And that's a real big thing for the growth. The APIs themselves are defining the workflow, because in my case, I had, a button handler, then a compose, then a dispatcher, and then a connector. And that was the 4 levels here that I had. Versionable, we already mentioned that. And if you want to add this kind of concept to your designs, to your builds right now, you can start right away. You don't have to wait, and you don't have to say, okay, I'm going to start a new project and I'm going to make it perfectly like this by any means. You can take existing code and just hack into it. You're not actually replacing anything. You're just building stuff parallel. So all your new code can be API first, and you can have your existing scripts just the same and convert things as you need to down the road. All right, so let's look at how to kind of get started. There's a few real core fundamentals to keep in mind. I hope this stuff is making sense and it doesn't sound like I'm out to lunch. Conceptually, it's probably stuff you're already doing. Pardon me?
This is good. This is really good.
All right, super. All right, so conceptually, there's a few fundamentals here. Things are split. I call it things, and the reason I say things is because it's not always a script, and I'll show you what I mean in a sec. Things are split into things, into separate parts. So there's a whole bunch of small bits and pieces. Just like in this script here, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, roughly 7 scripts here. There's probably another script to do something like fetch preferences and some other things like that as well. That would ancillary to this. But here I have roughly about 7 scripts, maybe 8 scripts in total. So they're separated into small chunks. Every chunk's function should be predictable. So this is a dispatcher. It shouldn't be composing emails. It shouldn't be handling buttons, right? The only thing that should be talking to it is some kind of script that is saying, hey, I need to send an email, right? Incidentally, with this example, we're only sending one. If we were to send multiple emails, that would probably be, which block do you think would handle that? I need to send multiple emails now. So this is kind of a tricky one. Oh, and I'm going to clarify it. Not multiple emails. I need to send one email to a batch of people. Where would you put the code in here?
Dispatch.
It could be, yeah, it might be dispatch, or it might be compose email, right? They're both not incorrect, but it's depending on what your API looks like. I would imagine all of these bottom level services, which are all of these ones down here, they all support batching. So it would make sense that the dispatch would actually send out in a batch, some fashion, even if it's only a single one. maybe convert the single into an array, for example, right? So that sort of makes sense. So probably the dispatch, but then you have to make sure that your API going into the dispatch has the right parameters that it can say, yeah, this is a single or this is multiple.
So then talk to us about disassociating from context-based thinking, where my brain as a FileMaker developer is looking at the go button saying, okay, where am I going to tell this script that the email addresses exist, in this case for multiple emails?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Right.
That's
so
a good one.
Where in this type of thinking could we access those things?
So let's say you're on a layout and you're on some kind of a compose an email layout or a marketing layout or something like that in FileMaker, and you want to hit a button and you want to send this thing that you've written, press announcement or whatever, out to 50 people. Right? The button handler is probably going to call that compose email will probably change its shape a little bit, and you'll probably decide it's going to need a list of email contacts, and it's probably going to need a subject and a body and a distribution medium. So it's going to have something like a substrate, might be like type Twilio, type mail, type SMS. I wouldn't put type Twilio. I'd put type SMS, because then you bind it to Twilio in terms of your way you're thinking, or type, some other function, Claris Connect or whatever it's going out to. And so that way you can pass that information down. So probably somewhere in your button handler, or you may have an additional script, because that use case is a little bit more unique, where you are dealing with the context of your found set and you want to send those people. So the found set is coming into the go button, and probably your button handler would compile the array. You would pass that into your composer, which has the ability to take an array, and it might take an array of emails, or it might take an array of email addresses. There's a difference there, bodies versus the address. And compose that, put it together, do some merging, whatever it needs to do, and then send it off to the dispatch.
Yeah, so you're either going to be passing either an array, and this depends on how you design it to begin with, right? So you're either going to be passing an array or a set of instructions.
Here's the thing. Don't ever pass arrays, and don't ever consume arrays. Don't ever pass them. Instead, pass an object.
Okay.
And then in the object, you have the array. And what I mean by that is do it like this. Hold on. Let me zoom out.
It makes sense, but go ahead.
Yeah. So if this is my param, right, that I'm going to pass into a script, if I pass just an array of stuff, right? If I pass just an array of stuff, I can never pass anything outside that array, right? In other languages, you basically call it wrapping. So instead, what you do is you wrap this into an object, and you would say emails, and I would use the plural, and that would be my array of emails.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah.
Distribution, oops. And that might be something like SMS. Oops.
Yeah.
Right? And now, by doing this, down the road, I can add something like time.
Right.
Right? Monday, 9 a.m.
It's funny looking at it this way now. Your first example of 1, 2, 3 reads to me now as literal text, as we would think of a calculation in FileMaker having a literal thing in quotes. That's inflexible.
I didn't write string because my printing is horrendous enough as it is. But yeah, but whatever in that email, this email doesn't have to have an opinion as to how it's designed. Email, like for example, inside here, that might say something like address, and that address might be something at something dot something, and it may also have something else in here. Maybe it might be subject, because maybe these are separate emails, individual emails.
Yeah.
right? So you have to design your API and think about how you want that to work, right? And that's where the architect comes in. They're thinking about all these parameters and they're saying, I'm not thinking about the code. I'm thinking about the big blocks, the big picture. And will this have a limitation in the future? And people come up to me all the time. I get literally probably once a day a private message that says, hey, you should add this in. You should add this into better forms. And it's like, yeah, I love that idea. But then I look and I say, well, hold on. Will that work? Because they'll say something like, you should add Twilio. I'm using this as an example. So now this distribution is hard coded to Twilio, but really Twilio is an SMS, and I want to have the ability to change from Twilio. I don't want to have that fixed opinion near the top. Fixed opinions or opinionated perspectives, or you could call it context, because in this case, context is Twilio, context is Claris Connect, context is MailChimp, whatever you're connecting to. You want context on the outsides of things, right? Because that's the stuff that touches the real world, right? Your top of your flow and your bottom of the flow have a lot of context, and the stuff inside should be context independent as much as possible. Does that make sense? That's kind of a fundamental concept or a tricky concept.
Are you saying there that you don't want to feed Twilio in there, you want to feed the SMS in there?
Yeah, that's right. And it's a fundamental way you think.
One day you're going to want to change from
bingo
Twilio to something else. And so if you're feeding SMS in, then today it can be Twilio and tomorrow it can be something else.
Exactly. So you're not thinking, you're abstracting your thoughts out a little bit there, right? And again, dealing with context, which what Brad was asking about, the context comes in at the top or context is at the bottom. In this case here, context is in here or context is here, but in the middle, not so much. All right. So that's the interface for something, whatever it is you're building. It should be flexible. And this is exactly where we were just talking about with where was it here? With Brad, is this interface here. This is really messy, so I apologize for that.
We're back on the, we're still
that
on the
interface is really flexible. Oh, sorry, my mistake. My bad. I'm looking at the wrong there. That interface there is very flexible. You have emails, you have distribution, you have time. If I want to add a new feature now, email, distribution, time, and I don't know, HTML temp, no, not that connection, maybe HTML template. I want to add template in here. Right, and I'm going to call it Mark, I don't know, template, temp1, something like that. So that didn't break anything because maybe only a bottom level consumer requires templates. SMS doesn't take a template, right? It's only, the only thing that's going to probably use the template is the MailChimp one, right? This one over here. That's the only one that's going to use a template. So it's okay. I didn't break my API by adding that feature, and I still am able to pass that information all the way down to the bottom. It'll pass right through transparent, all the way through my dispatch, all the way down to the bottom here. And I can still consume that template in some fashion. All right. So that's kind of the idea there. And this kind of ties into this. Things I should support the known unknown, right? I know that someone's going to come up to me and mention something that I can't think of right now. Right? I don't know what it is, but they're going to come up to me and say that. I was just somebody was just asking about a feature. I forget what it was. I don't know if it was Eric and I think we were talking just the other day about something. Eric, what was it we were talking about? There was a feature that we were talking about adding. And I said, somebody's going to want to use that. Somebody's going to
adding in better forms?
Yeah.
Oh man, we talk about all kinds of features to add.
So Eric's a good example. I bounce a lot of ideas off of him all the time. And how much do I hem and haw about just even naming things?
Oh yeah, it's endless. I have to sometimes mute you and
yeah, he pretty much, I can tell, right? Because he's got two monitors and he goes and like, if I'm showing something of interest, I know which monitor I'm on because he'll actually look, but I try to take it personal. Jerk. So, but you put a ton of thought into these kinds of things because the minute you stop putting the thought into it and you just say, I'm just going to code it, and I'm going to start writing it with an empty script and I'm just going to start writing code, that's the minute you start to paint yourself into a corner. So
Story of every developer's life is
bingo.
You know, what are they going to ask me that I haven't thought of yet?
That's right. It's so bang on. Like I think there's certain things that you should design, try to build in your life. One of them is a hello world to start off with. And on the other end, I think, I don't know what's above it. I'm sure there's lots of other codes. I do know actually. One is a parser, something that parses things, right? Goes through maybe a bunch of paragraphs and looks for an email. That's an interesting challenge in any language. Another one is to build a framework, because when you do that, any kind of framework, you start to think about, you're building something that other people can use that is flexible enough that they can use it for their use case, but it's opinionated enough that they're not going to, like a frame of a house, it's not going to fall down on them. So you have to have this interesting blend in there. And then I think the highest level challenge is a compiler. I think that's a whole other language.
Or what have I not even thought of yet, but what would I never even think of myself, but somebody else is going to come up with.
Exactly. And it happens all the time. Like I hear it all the time. Hey, can we do this with this? And it's like, currently you can't, right? And then, or maybe you can, we added the provision in there, it's a hard thing. But if you can think about as much as you can, your circle of unknown gets increases as well. But the stuff that you cover, or you're capable of handling in your existing code, increases as well. So let's look at an example here, because this stuff doesn't just apply to scripts, it applies to everything that you do. So here is actually a custom function that's in Better Forms. And the function shows a modal and it has some parameters. So it's pretty simple, but there's a lot of thought that did go into it. And I'll explain why in a second. First of all, from a naming convention, I personally prefer family, genus, and then like in terms of classification, and then the species, if you will, kind of like the Darwin type approach. So this case, all of the custom functions are prefixed with BF. And then what it's doing is it's setting an action. And then what type of action is it setting? It's showing a modal, right? So for the people who aren't Better Forms developers, all this is doing is creating a JSON object. That's all it's doing. And it's building out a JSON object, so you don't have to do it so hard. And we had something in here, and this is different from if you use this function from a year ago, the name changed, like the second parameter icon. It used to say type, I think. It used to say type, but type wasn't actually correct. It's not really the type, it was the icon. And it was I wouldn't say mislabeled, but it wasn't ideal. So what this function is doing from a programming interface is it's taking out all the simple features that you need, or the attributes that you need, title, icon, body, and theme, and it's making those accessible. But this particular widget in Better Forms has probably about 50 settings. So how do you give the developer access to all those other 50 settings without having an opinion as to which ones they should get and which ones they can't? So because someone's going to ask, well, can you make it automatically disappear 20 seconds or 5 seconds later, and so on. So we added an options key on the end, and the options key takes a JSON object. That makes it almost infinitely extendable, right? So that way, from an API perspective, it's really easy to use, but it's super flexible too. So if you need to have those extra features, you can put them in the options key. It does one other thing as well underneath the hood to make it easier for the developer to consume, is it actually adds this thing that it's building, this show modal, it automatically adds it into an array. So you don't have to take care of that. So that's a really common pain in the butt, is to build an array in FileMaker, but this takes care of it automatically. And it provisions the array if it's not defined already. So in one function, we have this tremendous functionality, and then we have a whole bunch that are like this. And that's kind of the idea of custom functions, where they have to do something a little bit more complex. We have, and maybe Eric, I don't know, over the next few weeks, we'll present on HAM, which is a headless authorization module. And it has 3 custom functions which you configure, but it's really, really crazy powerful. But we put a ton of thought into how it would work. And so far, I think it's going to really, really pay off as a module. So example scripts. Here's let's look at a real script. And this is one that's actually in our helper file, and it's called API user CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. Better Forms has this helper file, which is a separate FileMaker file that the odd time you need to write stuff into that file. And whenever you have to write into a file, normally you'd have to put a table occurrence and, go to layout from wherever you are and, new record and all that kind of stuff. But it's way easier for the developer to just use a perform script and do all the functions. You don't lose any context. You don't commit your existing record or anything like that because it's in a separate file. So it's actually a much better design. And in this case, what it's doing is it's controlling the user table. So you can create, read, update, or delete. So let's have a look at how that works. And it'll give you a little bit more idea, some fundamentals. So with this particular script, there's a table of users in this file over here, and we want to basically add a user into that file. So the user has a user object, and all you have to do is call this script with the shape of that object. If you have a key in the object, if you call the script with just an ID, only an ID, no other keys, the script will return the entire object, unmutated. If you call the script with a first name set, or an email, let's say an email, because there's no first name in this one. But if you call it with an email, then the script will update only that email and an ID, an email and an ID, and it'll return the entire record. If you call the script with, if you call the script without an ID, so you call the script without an ID, what do you think it would do? If there's no ID, that means it's going to be a new record, right? So in this particular case with this API, it'll actually try to match up by email because that's a very common use. And then it'll return, if it doesn't find it, it'll create the new record. So basically what it's doing, I don't know if you guys use this design pattern, but you should. It's a single loop error trap. So we're adding one loop at the bottom, or the top, I should say, and there's one loop, exit loop at the bottom with a true. So it'll only go through this loop one time. And this reduces a whole whack of nested if conditions. So we add this in there, and that's pretty much every script that we code like this. Excuse me. We're grabbing the stuff. We're checking if there's a delete key set. If we have a key called isDelete, then we delete that record because this particular interface is designed to create, read, update, and delete records, right? And then we do a few other things. We check if the ID exists, and there's some other stuff in here. We don't have to really go through the details of it, but I want to touch base on the important parts right here, right there. So if you pass an ID into this script and you say, hey, update this record, the script is smart enough to return an error for you, which is really, really important. When you're building these API first type designs, you have to be able to pass errors upward from the very, very bottom of your code up to the top. So in this case, what we're doing is it's looking for the record somehow, and it says error record could not be, or record, yeah, if you couldn't find the deleted, if it was looking for one to delete, it couldn't find it, so it's basically passing an error object back. That error object is using some custom functions. These functions are out of the Carbon framework. They're okay. I think they're pretty, they're flexible enough that we use them ourselves. Maybe somebody might have their own sets of error functions. Doesn't really matter as long as you're consistent. And
I'm sorry, what's the Carbon framework you keep referring to?
That's Geist Interactive's open source framework. So there's a few, like RCC has one called FM Starting Point, and there's a few other ones, and this is Geist version.
Oh, it's a general sort of.
Yeah, there's a bunch of code. I did a little bit of work on some of the bits and pieces in there at one time, so that's why I reference it.
Okay. Yep, I think I've heard of that. All right. Cool. Thanks.
Right, and it's fairly flexible. But it is that in that case, I'm not talking so much about that whole architecture. I'm talking about just implementing bits and pieces as you need. Right, and that's where these error functions come with. So what this is doing, this is just creating an error object. That's all that's doing there. And it's a JSON object, and then it's going to exit the loop, which means it goes right to the very bottom here, and then takes the result and it passes it out back at the end of the script. So if any parts of this script, there's a whole bunch of error trapping throughout here. If any parts fail, then you get booted back out again, right? If you tried to write to a record that doesn't exist, for example, an ID, pass an ID, or you try to delete an ID that doesn't exist, or if it tries to commit and it just doesn't exist. I think that's probably in here somewhere too. So that's an example of an API first type script where it's very, very predictable what goes in, it's documented in the top, and it's predictable what goes out, right? And it's very hard to see here, but if you look at the name here, and I borrowed this from somebody else, but I think it's a good idea, but I think it's a little hard to see. Those are actually curly braces, implying that it takes a JSON object in. I don't normally add these in anymore. I used to, and I don't because everything I do is JSON. So I just make the assumption now. Right? Does anybody have any questions about that and how that works? I wish we had code folding so you could compress these.
That's an interesting concept, having multiple exit places like that. We just had a conversation a couple of weeks ago at Portage Bay about having a singular exit point. So
okay, so I'm going to stop you there for a sec. You said exit. This doesn't have multiple exits. It has multiple branching that kicks you out of the loop. Single exit.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, single exit. I don't think scripts should have a whole whack of exits.
Yeah, that was the discussion we were having.
I think that's a bad design because and the reason I think it is because a lot of times you miss doing certain things.
Right.
So that comes down to a fundamental of API design. Your scripts, if it's a script, it should always return something. Even if that something is not going to be consumed by the caller, it should return at the very least a true. Right. And you say, well, why should it at least return a true if it's not going to return an object? I like to structure most of the scripts just like external APIs so that when the script returns, it's returning the mutated object. So in other words, if I have a table and it has some, quantity or something, some kind of calculation, has to add some secret sauce into a calculation. So I have to set some fields into the table and I have to get the sum, the answer. My script should set those fields and then it should return the entire object as JSON, right? And that way I can consume it in my next step. As far as the exiting with loop true, the main reason for that is if you have a script and you have two, let me just do this really quick here. You have two perform scripts. Perform script 1, and then down here, got some code, and then I got another perform script 2. Okay. This one here, let's say this thing returned 1, 2, 3. Okay, that script, oops. Okay, so my keyboard's all sitting in a box here. All right, and this script here doesn't return anything. You didn't put anything in here to return stuff. And later on here, or maybe sometimes the script does, but it doesn't explicitly do that. So you do a get script parameter.
Result.
Yeah, there we go. Oh yeah, sorry. I'm trying to type. I'm typing like I'm in JavaScript. Like I'm just typing. I'm forgetting I got to put set variable. So let's say I did something like this, and then result, and then in here it's something like this. It'd be something like get script parameter. Boom, boom. Thank you, whoever taught me that keystroke. Thank you very much.
Oh, somebody said result. Get script result.
Result. Yeah. Sorry, you're right. You're right. There we go. Okay. Okay, you got the idea. I'm not going to bother changing because you got the idea. So get script result. And when I get the script result in here, sorry, this is bothering me too much here. There we go. All right. When I get the result, right now, if this thing returned 1, 2, 3, and this didn't return anything, my result is 1, 2, 3.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's a little gotcha there. So your script should always explicitly return something because otherwise you're going to end up building potential holes in your code there, right? There's a little issue there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. There we go.
I do really like the exit loop model because it takes care of of the conundrum that multiple exits was trying to take care of, which
It's
is
not
I
just-
need to
yeah,
not execute some things
Yeah.
if it
It's really
fails.
good for air trapping, right? Because it kicks you
Yeah.
out of the loop. Kicks you out of the loop. And you can keep passing. Like if you have a little loop in here, for example, and you need to have an error, you can kick that out. You can keep kicking out until you get to the top and you blow everything out. Right. So we have another CRUD script. This particular CRUD, you notice there's no set fields in here. Well, there's one, set field by name. So it's actually flexible enough that if you ever add a new field, and this is another thing for API design, you want to make it flexible. If you add a new field in my table over here, I have this some kind of user table, right? And I want to put in a new field for whatever weird reason, right? I want to put something in there. I don't have to change anything. I just add the field and I'm done. Because my API does not have an opinion as to which fields it writes. You, as part of the interface, you must specify the field name that you're writing to. So that basically saves the troubleness of, again, less chance of screwing things up. You know, if the object has to have that new field in it, and it'll just write it, and it just works. Right? So that's the gist of how that is. Let me jump to. So here's what this looks like. If you were to build an entire app, pure API first, and no interface. Now there's a caveat there. There's no interface to the app. This is the Better Forms, the application, not the software that's rendering you the site, but the application itself. The UI is just another Better Forms app, right? The editor that you're using, you're communicating with a FileMaker backend, right? It's a practice what you preach thing. And that app is a multi-tenant or multi-organization. Multiple users can work in different organizations, get invited to. It supports things like, it's not released yet, but it's in development right now, environments and things like that. It's a pretty big app, right? There's a lot of code to it. Here's the relationship chart for it. I'll let you take that in for a sec. That's the entire application. And there's really only one relationship graph at the bottom here. And that's the real entities and how the things relate. We have one selector, one deleter, and there's a whole bunch of other fields and a bunch of tables. Now, you can't build a pure FileMaker app this simple because you need to add a ton of table occurrences for UI stuff in FileMaker. That's just how it works, right? But you can build chunks of your code like this. So you can have all the functionality of your code, UI aside. You can have the same amount of functionality as a big app like Better Forms is, and make it this simple. So you can see right away. Now, you can't get rid of complexity in a system. You can only do it so much, right? So that means there's complexity somewhere. So where's the complexity? Well, it's partially in the scripts, and it's partially in the UI. Most of FileMaker's complexity is in their UI, that comes from the table occurrence graph, not so much the scripts. But we have a little bit more in the scripts than average because we're practicing this API first, super strictly, and you end up with this really, really simple app. If you had to jump in here and I had to say, hey, you got to add a new table, that's pretty easy to do. You're probably going to add it into the selector. You can probably add it into the deleter, and you might add this new table into, I can't click on this. You might add it into here somewhere as well. Okay? Pretty maintainable. Any questions about that? Sorry. All right. Just a sec here. Just a couple of the little key points I want to just blast through really quick here, but I don't have slides for them because I didn't convert it because it's a little bit more text type stuff here. A few other things that follow fairly strictly with API first design, and everybody goes on about naming conventions, but very few people are truly consistent, I find. And I think that's incredibly important because if you're building your code in blocks, you need to know intuitively what that block is going to do. So your name of the script, for example, if it's a script or a custom function, should explain what it is. That's half your documentation right there. The parameters going into it, that's another part of your documentation. And then maybe a little bit of extra stuff to explain that, right? So the naming of things is really important. When you have really hyper consistent names, you can have some great advantages. For example, I personally prefer, and I would argue it to the death pretty much, because there's nerds way bigger than me that have argued this. IDs are ID. None of this underscore, triple underscore, Z, XX, because I need to push stuff to the bottom of the screen. You're pushing it to the bottom of the screen or the top of the list or whatever, because you have a crappy naming convention, right? If you call an ID, that's what it is. It already implies that it's primary key. Right? You don't need to say foreign key. You call it ID entity, whatever the entity is, ID invoice. That's foreign key, right? Says it all. All the information is there. They group together because they're all in IDs. You don't need to know. You know for every table what it is. There's never a guess. Now, some people put ID underscore or, that whatever it is you use, as long as you're super consistent across all tables, you'll end up with these advantages. Excuse me.
I love the way you think, Charles.
Pardon me?
It's very similar to the way I've thought for years, and it's good to get some validation, I guess.
So this stuff is not my ideas, though, right?
Sure, but you've adopted it because you agree with it.
I do, and I've adopted it for FileMaker because I spend about 70-ish% of my time outside of FileMaker now, right? I spend it in the JavaScript world on the front end. These guys, if you go to Stack Overflow and you ever have to look up something, like if you look up how to add an element to an array, you'll find like 6 screenfuls of code of people throwing different ideas and thinking about this kind of stuff, right? And there's people who sit and put a ton of experience in behind these kinds of concepts, and this is where they're at. So you could try to invent your own idea. So I think that's great. That's fun. But you can also try to take somebody else's ideas and build upon that, right? This way you can, it's like science, right? We're constantly building on lower principles. I think I mentioned already just regarding naming conventions. I like personally classification first, and then the species second. So like name first versus first name. That's my preference. I personally prefer lower camel case. And I always thought it was about saving keystrokes, right? Because a lot of times, it's an extra keystroke for people to type. But it's an extra place to make a mistake as well, right? So if you default everything to lower camel case, chances are that thing doesn't have any capitals in it. And then unless there's 2 words like name, capital first, that type of a thing, right? Parameters, same thing. Parameters for scripts. How many people do not use, actually, I don't know if you can make a survey for this easily, Eric, but how many people...
in the participants window, just open up the participants window and click yes or no on the button.
In the what window?
Everybody.
Yeah, I want to know what the percentage of people use JSON to pass script parameters and script results strictly, or they use other stuff.
I use a combination of, I use custom functions that compile JSON, but I did it because of exactly what you've been talking about here. Before the JSON stuff came along, I was doing it using that sort of let notation, but I still encapsulated all that into custom functions because I knew that JSON was coming along. And so I did it with the let notation in the custom functions, but then when JSON came along, I just changed the custom functions and all the rest of my code worked because of exactly what you're describing here.
So that's kind of interesting. So you wrapped it in a format. Too bad you didn't, if you knew the exact formatting of the JSON stuff, you could wrap it with the exact function. And then when you upgrade, it would just use that versus your custom function. So that'd be kind of interesting.
Yeah, but I actually like doing it with the custom. I've kind of built my own system with this. One of the things that the thing with FileMaker scripts and the thing that is wrong with all of these different ways of doing parameters is, I mean, FileMaker's already got something in it that can handle multiple parameters. They're called custom functions. So I designed a system that allows me to call a script with a custom function as the parameter. And for each of the multiple parameters that I want to pass in, it's just a parameter inside the custom function.
Mm-hmm.
And now I have 9 separate custom functions, one for when I'm passing one parameter, one from when I'm passing 2 parameters.
Yeah, but see, then you have 9,
parameters,
right? See?
But now I don't have to think about data structures or labeling them or anything. I can pass parameters into scripts the exact same way that I pass parameters into custom functions.
So here's the thing,
which is you know, it's C style rather than the PHP sort of labeled parameters style. But now I've got those custom functions, and if I ever come up with some better way of encapsulating all that data inside there, I can rewrite those custom functions and all my scripts still work. And I've got the same thing for passing stuff out with results.
So let's talk about custom or passing parameters for just a second. I'm going to push back on your idea a little bit, and I'll explain why, and we'll see if we can come to an agreement. Okay, let me just see if I can find my iPad here. It's up here somewhere. No, it's not.
I just wish FileMaker would implement passing parameters into scripts the same way they've got them passing into
I'm not sure I do.
JSON's good enough.
Yeah, I think so. And here's why. Okay. So you have two blocks of code. You have this block here, and it needs to call it takes I'm just going to call it invoice. That's something to do with invoice, okay? And you have another block of code, and it has something to do with line items. Okay? It does something with them. I don't know. It iterates over them. It does something with them. Whatever. Right? It's just it's conceptual. So passing into my invoice script, I pass an invoice object. I pass something that looks like this, and it's got like ID 1, 2, 3, and it's got address and main. And then it has a thing called lines. Okay. And that lines is an array of whatever the line item object looks like. And so on. All right. So that's what my object coming, oops. Let me do this. That's what my object coming into there is. Does that make sense? This thing here is coming into here. All right, to do something. Now I want to call my line script. I want to go from here, and I want to call, actually it's not going to be on the side, it's going to go in like this. And I want to call my line script, and I need to iterate over my line script because it's got to do some magic, I don't know, print stuff out or do whatever. So this needs to loop, right? This thing needs to loop around through, and it's going to make this call, right, out to here, boom. And it's going to loop through. When I'm consistent and I pass an entire object here, I just have to grab in my loop out of that sub-object one thing.
Yep.
And I send that one thing down through here. I probably have to augment it slightly because if my lines might need to know the parent ID, so I maybe have to add that on the outside. So I'm not going to pass, again, I'm never going to pass just an array. I'm going to pass an object. One of the keys might be ID parent or ID invoice, because the line items need to know that for whatever it does. And by doing that, I don't have to recompile a whole bunch of things. So like maybe I have another logger. Maybe I have another script, and it's going to log that transaction, whatever happened. And I want to call this thing. I want to log everything. So now I can take my get script parameter from up here, which is this stuff up here, that whole object, and I just have to pass it along. It's all intact. I don't have to do anything. I have to augment it just slightly in the perform script calculation to add in maybe where it came from or who the user is, some other metadata, but I don't have to do anything else. When I have those parameters, when I'm not thinking about the stuff as terms of object and I'm thinking about it as separate parameters, I don't have that ability to do that anymore. right? So that gives me that limits what I can do, and that means I have to have extra stuff to do translations inside my code to build new objects to send them out. I don't want to have to do that. I want to take my existing chunk of code and just send it off.
Now,
If there's extra stuff, who cares?
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. But I'll see. For me, that invoice object that's one parameter because it's an object. But what if you're passing in certain preferences or a bunch of other options or various other things that are only relevant to that? Let me.
But they are relevant, though.
If that's okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
That are only relevant to that invoice script. Or maybe it's relevant to a couple of other scripts because you've built it in an API first approach. But I don't see script parameters as objects. I see script parameters as things that you pass into the parameter to make it do into the script to make it do different things depending on what you're passing in. And an invoice is one of those things you'll pass in, and some kind of options or other things you'll pass in, whatever else. And so, yeah, I guess that kind of says it. To do that, I don't want to have to manually build all the JSON to create all those different parameters for that script.
I think if you're consistent, then really if I just pull back just a tiny bit, when I say get script parameter, I'm grabbing one object, right? So we're both doing the same thing at that level. Okay, the membrane between the two scripts is one string of text, right? You're wrapping it up in another thing. I'm just leaving it in JSON. You're wrapping your JSON with the other parameters. I'm just leaving it as JSON. It's basically the same as what Paul was saying. It's just a JSON object, really.
I think. Can I chip back
in?
Yeah,
but if you want to, if you want to pass a bunch of things into that invoice script, but you only want to pass the invoice itself to something else, then you have to start doing some unpacking. Whereas if that invoice is one of multiple parameters you're passing in. And of course, when I get into the script, I pull all the parameters out into variables. So I almost never use get script parameter or get script result. I've always got those encapsulated in my custom functions. And I also have custom functions that do the unwrapping once you're in the script. And so then if I want to pick that invoice up and pass it to a different script, I've got it in a variable already.
Gotcha.
This might make more sense if I was ever to sit down and show you. I think you'd actually think it's pretty cool, just because I think.
Paul, you were gonna chip in there with something.
I was going to say the thing that I used for my script parameters. I've always used named pairs of some form or another. And initially, I built my own manually constructed kind of pseudo XML parameters with custom functions. And then I switched to the hash functions for the let format. And then when JSON came along, I realized that because the JSON set element command can have as many rows effectively with the square brackets, like substitute as you like, it's really easy to read.
That is your parameters. Those are your parameters, aren't they?
It's really easy to read, and it's really easy to look at a parameter and think, oh, I need another thing for line items. So I just duplicate that row and I put line dot, I change the line dot, I don't know, amount to line dot VAT code or something. And it's done. And it's really easy to read and see that you've got your consistency, because it's really nice format for generating.
Paul, when you reinstantiate your stuff locally in the script, so once you've consumed the parameter, do you automatically break out stuff into keys, or do you explicitly do,
I have an ongoing battle with myself. I guess my current philosophy is to break it out into the top level items. Okay, so if in my JSON parameter, the one for invoices that you were talking about, I might have a top level object.
So but you would do you have a custom function to do that, or do you explicitly do that?
The top levels out. So I might end up with 3 variables, one of which was environment, one of which was invoice, one of which was I don't know, logging or something.
Yeah.
Right. And then later on, I would probably might break those
Sure.
down as I need to. But you don't.
So you're explicitly
you're
explicitly creating that object. I do that as well. I used to have a function, as Dave suggested, is where it would automatically break out the parameters into variable, but they're invisible, and you don't.
Yeah, you're right there.
Yeah, that's a problem. So I prefer to explicitly set those because it reminds any future developer what's going on there, what it's expecting. And it's only
my functions that break them out do actually do that. I've actually got I'm
saying so you can see it in the script though, like so you can visually see
it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I've actually got one custom function called script parameter get next. And so at the beginning of each of my scripts, I have explicit set variable steps that set the variable name that I want to use for what's coming in, but I don't have to write anything fancy in there for each one of those. I'd use the same value for each of those set variable steps. It's just a custom function.
So what if you change? So that means you can never change the order of your parameters. Then is that correct?
That is correct. It is the one downside, but I much prefer that. I mean, it's the way C and Swift and everybody else does it. You know, and I come from a C background, so I think that's
most functional things do that. Your parameters are in an order. Quite often, the first one will be something in the class, and the second one will be a flexible object like JSON's like that. JavaScript's like that. So I'm just going to jump off to something else here. This is just kind of a worksheet, and I'll just show you how. It's just kind of really simple, just to help you wrap your head around something. So if I'm building some type of a script like we just talked about that's going to consume something, I started off with thinking about what its purpose is, right? So maybe its purpose is to send an email, send multiple emails, send emails. So I'm just going to mark that down there. And then I have to think right away, what does it return, right? What is it going to return? If I'm going to have a routine that's going to be able to send multiple emails, what type of information would I want back? Well, multiple emails is kind of funny because you don't want to stop the whole process when one email gets bad from your carrier, from MailChimp, say. So I probably want to return probably an array of errors. Right, and that's probably going to be an array of errors, and I probably want to maybe some type of a success or something like that as well. I'm probably not going to return all of those emails because it might be a big object, and it's very unlikely that I'd consume it again. But I might return that at least. And then I have to think, okay, well, in that case, so that's the second step here, and then what is it going to consume to be able to do that? Well, I'm going to need something like maybe an email array. I'm just going to put squares for an array. Possibly, if it's going to take one or more emails, I may have to think about that as well. Probably body and subject and body, right? And then I got to think about the workflow. Okay, so I probably if I wanted to be able to support multiple emails or a single email, I don't always have to have the caller converted into an array. So I'm going to convert it to an array. So I'm going to say this has to go to an array of this. So that way, if it's not already, that'll be like my first step. And let me see, then I need to somehow do some kind of a looping thing, probably to compile the build emails, maybe. Build. Right. And after I build them, I might build one at a time. Maybe then I'm calling an external dependency that it's going to be some type of a MailChimp connector, right? Right, there's a little sloppy, right? And then I'm probably going to want to check from MailChimp. I'm going to want to say errors. Oops. And I'm going to probably log the errors into some kind of log, right? And then when I'm done, so I guess this will be going around back into here. And then when I'm done, I'm going to return my error object. Probably going to track. So this is kind of how you would sort of do that. In this case, this script is totally context independent. And then I'm going to think, do I need any authentication? Do I need to make sure that the caller is probably not. Authorization, I don't think so, because it's fairly low down. I do probably want to make it PSOS ability, right? So I might want to have a little perform script on server converter, which is basically, I would sort of call this script, and that would run that same script. It would exit the original script and run it as PSOS. And do I want to have error handling? Yes, I do want to have error handling, and I'm not going to put any tests in at the moment, right? So that's kind of the idea of thinking about this stuff in chunks. And then finally, I'm going to think about naming it, and I'll probably call it something like compose. Or, emails, compose, email, something like that. So that's kind of the idea of how I think about these kinds of things. I usually just do this without a template. I just draw the flow chart and roughly, just really, really crude. Don't think about it too much. And then I pseudocode it out the same way. And then I start filling in the blanks, or I pass it off to someone else. Same kind of an idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Charles,
That's good.
Yes.
can I ask you something while this is on the screen? Earlier, you were referring to versioning, and that's one part where I'm a bit more struggling of where to trace the line. Where is it that you're going to say, okay, I can still fiddle with my original script, and then no, wait, this is different altogether. Let's make a V2, and then so those kind of calls. I'm trying to see if there's a pattern or a differentiator that I can rely on to say, okay, this is when I need to flip the switch, kind of. Of course, if there's heavy use of one thing, you don't want to be changing something from under one's feet. But sometimes it's not as clear cut. So I'm just seeking.
So here, if we looked at this log routine, right? That could be as simple as just creating a record in a file, right? It creates a record in a file and it dumps a JSON object in there of what it was passed, and you're done. Right. But then you come out and say, oh, man, this log's not bad, but I really want to report it. And I want to call an external API log because maybe I have a whole bunch of these things. And I want to report that into some monitoring system like Zabbix or something like that. So I want to call an endpoint there, and I'm going to report my log. So then on the information board, big dashboard, we can see what's going on. Site 23 had an error. So that would be a new use case for that log. So you could keep the API coming into the log, and inside that log, call the low-level connector that's going to connect, like that log routine. So we'll just start with this here. We'll start with just this here, okay? And we'll break this all the way out into here. Okay, so this is, we're going to call it, this is the new, this is logger 2. Right? Now this one is going to probably, we can do a couple things. We can call that new one from this script, right? And that way this is the interface for all of the things, because I maybe have 20, 30, 40 scripts that are calling that same old log system. And I add one line in this code that's perform script, and I repackage up a JSON object that has a little bit more information. Maybe it has the site location, the IP address, the server, some other stuff that we need to know now, because we're going to log this other logger. It's going to take that information and it's going to maybe call Zabbix or something like that. Right? So in this case, it's not really a version 2. I'm extending the functionality of the first one. Now, new systems, any new scripts I create in the future, they can call this version 2 directly. They don't need to call it like I'm doing here and go through there, because maybe that has some limitations, right? Because this API coming into this script may be just too narrow. It's not flexible enough. So that's one way you can do those kinds of things, right? So all your new code effectively is calling the new scripts.
Okay, thanks.
And that's kind of the core concept. I mean, there's tons of little things to think about in here. I just touched only a little bit on error trapping and and related tables and things like that. But naming is probably one of the biggest things if you can really knock that down, because then you can make assumptions about stuff. For example, we always name our JSON keys after the same key as the table, the actual key in the table, the field name. And by doing that, then you can have scripts that can automatically populate a record, and you don't have to think about it anymore. So, and that's the I think that's pretty much the end of that. That's kind of how we think about these kinds of things. But if anybody has any questions of anything, or different ways, maybe ways we can improve it.
Just a little bit of thing in JSON. I'm using JSON now for script parameters and script results. Before that, I was using like maybe some other people the hash function that was made popular by Six Fried Rice. But JSON brings in nesting, and that's really nice. One thing I'm still not struggling, I don't necessarily like with JSON is handling dates. Right now, I'm just sending them as numbers. But I was curious to see if some other people are doing different stuff with that. So
that's interesting. You're doing get as number, and then converting it back, so you got a consistent format or a consistent unit, I guess it is.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do for dates, Paul?
Dates. Oh, that's a tricky one, isn't it? Really, I guess most of my work has been with UK dates, so I'm passing them as the string values for dates.
And when you're putting dates in JSON, what do you do? Like, do you convert it, or do you just leave it as a system format, or?
Yeah, I'm mostly as a system format. Yeah. I have been considering recently the use of the year plus month plus day, because that seems to get converted in most circumstances to a proper date if you drop it into a FileMaker field, whereas minuses and slashes don't always, if it's the wrong order. That seems to work in all locales, if you see what I mean. If you have
it is a pain, though. That's probably the one unit that stinks the most across computers, because there's at least, just the ISO standards. I don't know, there's maybe 5 or 6 that are popular. Yeah. It seems like XO or whatever.
Exactly. It is the one thing that there is no right answer to, isn't it?
Yeah.
Charles, this is Chris Conger chiming in on the date.
Hey, Chris.
For Satori, we ended up going with get as number because it allowed us then to sort. Part of it depends on what you're using the date for, but it did allow us to sort then I don't know what the tables better in better forms if we're using get as number.
Yeah. So if you're sending it to a third-party system, like for better forms, for example, you can format it. You can take any format and format to any other format. So it's pretty easy. We have a library in there that allows you to do that. But if you just the FileMaker to FileMaker and they're 2 different formats, then that seems like almost like that's the best one. You think, or does anybody do a FileMaker to FileMaker, two different machines, like 2 different continents, different?
Yeah, and then when you do it as number, if Steve in the UK, if I send it as number, it'll take my format, month, day, year, and then for him it would turn into day, month, year when he does it with number. I believe it's correct.
Yeah.
Charles, did you know that Canada, I think, is the only country that doesn't have a formal standard?
Really?
Some people use month, day, and some do day, month. And the government, to prevent the the unknown, goes year, month, day. Yeah,
it's and I think that's the whole idea of like the Unix times and stuff. They're trying to, those are attempts to do it, to sort it out. But, FileMaker probably came along and said, oh my God, this is so ugly. We can't do this. We just got to give them something a little bit better. Right?
I guess people don't, human beings reading dates want to read something they're familiar with and can understand quickly, don't they? So
Yeah, it's a real hard one. And then the granularity makes a difference too. Like a Unix timestamp, do you include the seconds or the milliseconds? And that's like another 3 digits on the thing. So that throws you off. And sometimes it can't be. It doesn't actually have to be there to be valid. Like you could have two numbers that are the same date and they're different lengths, right? So it's pretty crazy.
Yeah. I think the reason I've shied away from using numbers, the get as number for dates, is that when I'm debugging stuff, I've got no idea what the date is, and I just find that's too painful. I'd much rather see it as something I can read and understand when I'm testing or comparing stuff. So that's why I've shied away from numbers, I guess. That's why I think this, with using the plus separator, starting with the year, seems to be that whatever locale, if you set that into a date field,
I just saw that. I just saw that as a tweet or something. That works across all formats, right? Using the plus as a separator. Does anybody know that trick?
No, what is that?
It's why it was a tweet, wasn't there?
I think it was a tweet from Todd Geist.
yeah, that's right. You're right. It was if you use the plus separator when you make the custom dates.
Start with the year, yeah.
Yeah, year, month, day with pluses in betweens.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the official one then for FileMaker, right? It's supported in everything.
Yeah, it works.
Supposedly.
That works in FileMaker. You type that into a FileMaker date field and that'll do it right.
Regardless of your locale and your settings.
That's pretty interesting. So that's really what we should be.
That's handy.
And this only came out like now. That's crazy.
How long's that been?
I think it's
30, 25 years. I finally figured out dates last week. What? How does that work?
That's awesome.
I vaguely remember that I read it was something to do with the Japanese version. I can't remember, but I might be completely wrong. But that's just a recollection I have, that it had something to do with inputting Western dates in Japanese systems.
Anyway, I didn't want that one question to be hijacking the discussion.
That's okay.
But, so and by the way, it's a really good issue. By the way, Charles, if ever, I don't know, you have things set, I think in different weeks and different topics and everything. But if ever you do one on error handling by itself, I'll be sure to attend.
Well, you know what? Error handling it's not hard. It's really easy to incorporate. You pretty much need to use that technique where you're doing one loop, single loop, and you're jumping out, and you continue to pass that up through all your code. And that's pretty much the gist of it. There's not really a lot to talk about.
Well, when everything is in a transaction, that's nice. But there's some stuff where if you're doing, say, a bunch of emails and one might stand out and the next one may not, then how what do you report
so for
on?
that, what we do is when we have a multiple chances of multiple error, we put the errors in a key called errors, and it's an array, and then it's an array of the individual error objects. Right, so errors goes under errors. If that script has the potential of throwing more than one error, because it's never going to throw one error and then another time 10 errors. It's always going to be one of many, or even if the many can only be one, like an email script, or if it's just some other kind of script that does something like, I don't know, create an invoice or something like that, charge PayPal. You're not going to continue that process and if you have multiple errors. So the script either returns an error object as the result. The entire object is the error, right? So it has a number of keys, or it returns a key called errors, and within that, it's an array of errors, if that makes sense.
Good. I'll need to jump off. So thanks very much for.
Thanks for attending.
Great presentation.
Robert, where are you located?
In Montreal.
Montreal. Okay. Cool. Super. Right. So that more or less concludes my my rant. So sorry if it took so long.
That was awesome, Charles. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Really, it's been so useful for us. And all the new things that we have to do work in somebody else's system. That's how we do it now. Then we don't have to touch any of their code. We create our own workflows. It doesn't have an impact to the table occurrence graph. They're not seeing a bunch of ugly in there and so on. Scripts are all in nice clean folders. And, any developer can go in later on and say, hey, which script, do you have a script that does this? Yeah, here it is right here. And it's logical. So that's been the biggest bonus for us. And really, we just added, we didn't have the ability to change credit card, right, on our site. So we had to add that in. And I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be a big process, right? And then I look, okay, no, actually we have an API that does this, one that does that. We added literally 6 lines of code in a script, something like that. 10 lines of code. And now we just added this whole ability to update people's credit cards. And it's all because we're using existing APIs that we already have. We have one that updates a customer organization, one that updates Stripe, one that updates the Stripe customer, and so on. So it's just calling one after these little building blocks, calling one after the other. And that's when you start to really, really see these gains. We're adding a ability to add environments, production, like a development, test, and production environments. And it's a really complicated thing because you need to take snapshots of people's pages, their layouts, their forms, their server, they connect the domain they have provisioned, all this kind of stuff. And that snapshot needs to be immutable, but you don't want to replicate a ton of code. You need to, so we have these repositories. Every time somebody hits save, it goes into a repository that's locked. And then we take a snapshot of the repos that particular environment is using. And this is all built on a whole bunch of these APIs. And it's just starting to come together now because we had to build out about 8 or so, or maybe 6 or 8 APIs at the low level. And, so this huge, really, really intimidating job is actually coming together because we're just building out these fundamental blocks, and then slowly and suddenly it'll be a final feature. So I hope it's useful for some people anyway.
Sounds like we're done.
Yeah, pretty much. It's one of those. Let's see. It's supposed to auto record, but I don't think we recorded this. Pause. This is pause and a stop. So I'm going to say stop. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Red recording light on my screen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was recording.